From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Monday, April 27th, 2015. A report back from the largest commemoration of the Armenian Genocide's 100th anniversary held outside Armenia will bring you the voices of a community searching for recognition of its history, and Tales of a Grim Sleeper, a documentary about an epidemic of murders of black women that went unsolved for decades. Filmmaker Nick Broomfield and activist Margaret Prescod, host of Sojourner Truth, will join us. Plus, why service workers in the U.S. Senate are organizing. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
The death toll from Saturday's devastating 7.8 magnitude earthquake in Nepal has risen to 3,800. That's more than double the initial estimate. Tens of thousands of people remain homeless, and concerns are increasing of emergency food and water supplies running out. Bodies are still being pulled out of the wreckage caused by the massive quake, the likes of which had not been experienced in Nepal for about 80 years. The quake caused an avalanche on Mount Everest, and tremors were felt as far away as the Indian cities of Mumbai and Chennai. UNICEF is warning that hundreds of thousands of children are particularly vulnerable to waterborne diseases in the aftermath of the crisis. More aftershocks are expected, and a terrified population is spending nights out in the open. The Guardian newspaper pointed out that Nepal's earthquake was all the more devastating because of pre-existing poverty. Quote, their ability to cope with a major disaster is crippled by the lack of economic and social infrastructure that people in richer nations take for granted. Rahul, how important is it for us to point out that poverty always exacerbates such natural disasters? And we've seen this in places like Haiti, right?
Yeah, I think it is very important. You can think about Haiti, you can think about the earthquakes in Pakistan, you can think about the tsunami back in 10 years ago. And in fact, the death tolls from all of these things just vastly dwarf anything we see from natural disasters in the West. But I think there are two things going on. One of them is poverty, and the other is the level of social organization, especially as indicated by things like building regulations and their implementation. And so you see, for example, from countries that are middling income like Turkey, and the earthquake in 1999 was partly so devastating because there had been so much relatively unregulated building of high-rises. So I think that we have to look for the causes of this, not just in the natural disaster itself, but in the system of global inequality we have, and in the fact that so many countries still have states that aren't really providing for their citizens properly.
Mm-hmm. The Wall Street Journal has reported that the Obama administration has been operating under more lax standards in its drone program in Pakistan than in other countries. Anonymous officials told the journal that the president secretly signed a waiver authorizing the CIA to forego new rules for the Pakistan drone program that were conceived to minimize casualties. The guidelines, issued in 2013, were a response to widespread international condemnation of the drone war and a number of reports showing that strikes amounted to extrajudicial assassinations. The government officially concluded last week that a January 15th drone strike on an al-Qaeda compound in Pakistan inadvertently killed 2 foreign captives. President Obama took full responsibility for those killings. Adam Entus, writing in the Wall Street Journal, said, quote, if the exemption of the new rules had not been in place for Pakistan, the CIA might have been required to gather more intelligence before its strike. Now, it's not clear if the tighter guidelines have been implemented even in other parts of the world where the U.S. conducts drone warfare. Rahul, are you at all surprised that the Obama administration issued these new rules and then just didn't follow them, at least in Pakistan's case?
That's a nice way of putting it. There's something funny about Obama. He's a really strong believer in the rule of law, and also in immediately circumventing it. So he totally believes in the War Powers Act, but it doesn't apply in Libya because he gets people to argue that that's not really a war since American soldiers aren't at risk. So a novel definition where you can bomb a country and not be at war. He wants to uh, eliminate. He wants a new authorization for drone strikes and other military action. He doesn't believe the 2001 authorization is sufficient, but if he's not going to get it, he'll go ahead and keep on doing the strikes he does. He talks about new regulations to try to minimize the civilian casualties from drone strikes, and then it turns out he sets them aside in the case where he thinks that it's somehow most important. So among the things set aside is the requirement that the people being bombed be judged to be an imminent threat to the United States, which means basically that if you're killing people just because they're members of an organization, they're not armed, they're not shooting at anyone, and they don't seem to be an imminent threat, that's a violation of the laws of war.
Right. And then here in the U.S., more than 2 weeks after a young African-American man named Freddie Gray was first arrested by police in Baltimore, Maryland, he's being laid to rest today. In addition to family and friends, Gray's funeral is expected to draw officials from the White House as well as loved ones of police victims. Gray died just over a week ago after slipping into a coma. His neck was nearly severed by a violent arrest by police. The Baltimore Police Department has admitted that Gray was delayed in receiving the immediate medical treatment that he needed. Major protests over Gray's arrest and death over the weekend resulted in the arrest of 34 people. Baltimore Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake shot back at the protest that apparently turned violent, saying she was, quote, profoundly disappointed. Now, Rahul, there's been very little attention in the news coverage of these protests to the fact that police effectively killed yet another black man, and there's a lot more focus on the violence of the protests, right?
Well, yeah, and it's deplorable what are the sort of predilections of the news media, and also I think what are some of the default assumptions of much of the viewing public. But I think we can take it as given that this is what's going to happen when there's property damage associated with the protest. We saw it as far back as 1999 in Seattle. The main issues always get sidelined. So I think what the movement needs to say is this is an incredibly important issue. Police brutality, in this case, basically deliberately negligent homicide, and something needs to be done about it. And we have a unique political opening where actually people are very receptive to the other side of the story, and people are beginning to view police actions as a potential threat to them.
Right.
In that situation, it's all the more important that protesters be very disciplined.
Thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. An estimated 130,000 people gathered in Los Angeles on Friday, many traveling from outside the city to march for justice on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. Southern California, where this program is produced, is an epicenter of the Armenian community, the largest group of Armenians living outside Armenia. On the anniversary, young and old, men and women and children gathered. Whole families and groups of friends congregated. People held signs thanking the various governments that had recognized Turkey's guilt in perpetrating the genocide. Others wore T-shirts reading, "Our wounds are still open." Most wore black to mourn the 1.5 million dead, and purple to symbolize the color of the forget-me-not, the official flower symbol of the commemorations. Well, the Uprising crew was at the march, and today we bring you this report.
You're here today?
Just recognizing the Armenian Genocide, 100 years.
Is this personal to you?
It is my personal, yes, it's my nation, and we did a lot of people died for these days. Yeah.
And it's important to be here among all these people?
Very important. For every single Armenian in the entire world, it's the most important day today.
I'm here also to remember our ancestors and how they suffered in 1915 during the genocide. And we are here to demand recognition. And all these people are here. They left their work, their homes, and they're here to commemorate and remember.
What does it mean to you personally? What sort of stories have you been told about your own heritage?
We've grown up hearing about these stories from our grandparents, how they lost their parents, their kids. They had to leave Armenia and then go to Lebanon or other places and to survive. And they told us the stories, so it can't be not true. So we remember and we honor and we want recognition. We're all here for that reason, so that it doesn't happen again. And we are very proud of our nation and we'll continue demanding until we get justice.
We're here to represent the Armenians in for the Armenian Genocide.
Yeah. Why is this so important to you?
Because 100 years ago, our ancestors went through an extremely traumatic effects on our people, and it hasn't been recognized by Turkey officially, and it's just something that is very emotional for everybody. And knowing that it's been 100 years and how much we've come from that, but yet still we can't heal until that's acknowledged.
I think it's good to take a moment out of our day to remember those who died. So more than marching in anger, it's about marching to remember those who died and our ancestors and also those who survived. So to know that we could be here because of those who did survive. And I think that's really important, and it's the least we could do is take a moment out of our day to remember, and also to remember all the genocides that are happening now and are continuing to happen, and that we should be fighting against that kind of, like, remembering our humanity and fighting against those kind of injustices. So yeah.
What sorts of genocides are happening today?
Yeah, I mean, in the past 10, we have Syria, which I think you can argue at this point is turning into a genocide in a way. I mean, a genocide, we have to be careful how we use the word, but anything that's happening where hundreds of thousands of people are dying is shouldn't be happening, and I think we have to remember that as much as we can. So by recognizing the past, we can recognize that the future, these things shouldn't be happening. So I think it's important.
We're here to help support the Armenian Genocide.
And are all of you related?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mother and my grandmother.
3 generations of women? Why is this so important to all of you?
It's very important to have the genocide be recognized in general, because there are people out there who don't see this as a genocide. They use it as like atrocities. They call it, what's the word I'm looking for? They call it like massacres. They never actually refer to it as a genocide as it should be. And we're just here to support the fact that it is a genocide.
It's our duty as Armenian to come and support Armenian cause and let everybody know that this happened. And after 100 years, we're going to come again.
After 100 years, what this has become about is really keeping the memory of the 1.5 million alive. Historical revisionism is not going to take away our drive and our motivation to really keep the memory of the 1.5 million alive. We are here, we are marching for justice, and we are demanding the truth.
You're carrying a sign that says, "Thank you, Poland, for recognizing the Armenian genocide." Why has the U.S., our own country, not done it?
Well, it all comes down to foreign policy and politics, and it's just a matter of giving into Turkish pressures. As is known, Turkey is an ally to the United States, and that's understandable, but when it comes down to is honoring history and truth as it took place. This is a widely documented historical event, and it ought to be called a genocide.
I'm 12 years old. I came here because it's the 100-year anniversary of the genocide. And I wanted to show that I know that, it's important and stuff. I just wanted to, show that, I am Armenian as well.
Our wounds are still open. Beginning 1915, the big genocide of Armenians.
How does it affect you personally? Can you share some stories?
My grandparents were killed in genocide in Turkey. They originally were in Turkey, and after the genocide, they immigrated to Greece and then to Armenia.
So your parents emigrated to Greece and Armenia?
And then from Greece to Armenia in 1924. So,
all these years later, the genocide hasn't been recognized. Why do you think that is?
not recognized from some countries, but many countries recognized it.
Not the U.S.
Not the U.S. because Turkey is allied to U.S. I think that's the reason. Even Obama promised to, when he was elected, he promised to recognize the genocide, but it was a lie. So,
are you happy to see so many people out here?
of course, I'm very happy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm here to demand justice for the massacre that happened not over 100 years ago today in Armenia for no reason.
How old are you?
17.
Why is this so important to you?
It's important because we're not recognized, especially here in the U.S. So we're just trying to gain that recognition from Obama, and we're very thankful for everywhere and everyone that has recognized us.
And is that sort of an emotional issue for your family and yourself?
Yeah, because many of our ancestors were living there and had to go through all of that pain and misery and tears and yeah.
Did your parents and grandparents tell you stories of your own ancestors?
Personally, no, because that's too much of an emotional, touchy subject.
But you know that it impacted your family?
Yeah, like my great-grandma and stuff like that.
And are your friends all here? And
yeah, friends, cousins, family, and others.
My grandfather and grandma, they killed. It was killed in Turkey.
How long have you been in the U.S.?
I've been in U.S. 1988, from 1988.
And those stories were passed down to you by your grandparents?
Yeah.
And why is it important to recognize what's happening 100 years later?
We need to recognize from the first day, but they never recognizing Turkish government.
Are you happy to see so many people out here today?
I'm happy.
Thank you.
I'm 15 years old, and like he said, it's the 100th year, and so I'm here to recognize it, and now's the time.
Do your parents and grandparents tell you stories about what happened?
Yeah, they do. It's been passed down.
And that's really important for you?
Yeah, they really encouraged me to come here today, so that's why I'm here.
Do you feel good being around so many members of your community?
Yeah, I do. I took a picture. It's really nice. A lot of people here.
Are you going to post them to Facebook?
I already did.
And that's a report back from the March for Justice that took place on Friday in Southern California, in Los Angeles, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. 130,000 people were estimated to have been in attendance. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. Kolhatkar. Los Angeles in the 1980s and 90s was an epicenter of violence and drugs. The worst impacted part of the city was South Los Angeles, where a spate of murders of mostly young black women went unsolved for decades. And then, 4 years ago, a man by the name of Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested in connection to the murders of a number of women who were shot with a .25 millimeter gun. Franklin was picked up after DNA from one of his relatives linked him to saliva on the bodies of victims. The women aged 14 to 36 were only a small number of women who are still missing. Some of them, but not all, were sex workers. The story of the murders, the man who may have been behind them, and the city where it all happened forms the basis of a new documentary called Tales of the Grim Sleeper by Nick Broomfield. Dubbed by journalists following the story, the Grim Sleeper was so named because it was thought that the killer took a break of 13 to 14 years from killing before starting up again in 2012. Tales of the Grim Sleeper was shortlisted for the Academy Awards Best Documentary nominations and was just picked up by HBO Documentaries. HBO is going to start airing the film on its channel today. Joining me to discuss the film is Nick Broomfield, award-winning filmmaker of Tales of the Grim Sleeper, whose earlier films include Eileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, and Sarah Palin, You Betcha, and Margaret Prescod, founder of the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders and host of Sojourner Truth Radio, which airs on KPFK Pacifica Radio every Tuesday through Friday at 7 a.m. Welcome to Uprising, Margaret and Nick.
Good to be here, Sonali.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, I have to say, the incredibly amazing, incredibly disturbing. I had a hard time sleeping last night after I watched it. And the most incredible part about it was that people outside of LA, and even probably most people in LA, haven't known that this is a story that took place right here. First, I'd like to start, Margaret, with you, since you've been involved in the story for many, many years. And we know that many women have gone missing, but this person who's now been arrested 4 years ago has only been arrested in connection with the murders of a handful of women. How serious has this issue been?
It's been very serious because I think anyone watching this program, listening to this program, would know and recognize very well that if it was one young white West Virginia student that goes missing, it's on the news every day, the whole world knows about it. But to have scores of black women in South LA to be killed, to be victims of a serial killer, and a lot of people in South LA don't even know about it, much less the broader Southern California area, much less the nation or the world. It's the kind of devaluation of the lives of black women that we connect very much with the mass movement that's happening now on the street about Black Lives Matter. When I founded the Black Coalition in the mid-1980s, our theme was every life is of value, black women's lives count, right. Black women's lives matter, and there you go.
Similar, right, almost exactly the same theme.
Yes.
Nick, why did this story interest you, and how did you determine how to go about approaching it? Because you essentially interviewed the friends of the person that people now believe is the Grim Sleeper, Lonnie Franklin.
Well, I've lived in Los Angeles a long time. When I first came here in the 70s, the city actually there was a lot more contact with South Central Los Angeles than today. There were much more federal funded programs. In fact, my mother-in-law had a medical center there. And there was a lot more toing and froing. I think the federal funding all got cut off, then the crack went in, and I think what we have now is two cities. We have the sort of white, wealthy city, and you have South Central, and there's no communication between the two cities. So when I came across this case, and there were, inklings of maybe 200 women disappearing, which is a kind of mini genocide happening in the center of Los Angeles, I thought, how is this possible? So I went in with a very simple question, which was, how is it possible that this number of people could disappear inside the city? And of course, and the film really is that investigation and that story. And you realize that the two cities have completely different value systems and completely different life expectations. And that's really, I think, the most devastating thing about the film, because it's only 15 miles from where I live in Santa Monica that this is happening. And I think people in this city are so unaware of what is happening. And, Margaret, for 25 years, has been pioneering this, trying to get an investigation. Even today, despite the fact that there are this number of people missing, that it took 25 years for the police to catch Lonnie Franklin, there's still been no internal investigation. I mean, there should really be some kind of massive inquiry as to how this is possible to have happened. It's such a disgrace.
Now, Margaret, let's talk about the fact that there are about a dozen murders being pinned on Franklin. The name given to the serial murderer was the Grim Sleeper because the people thought that for years, for over a decade, there were no murders being done. Do you believe that?
A lot of people question that, and we're actually not sure. You know, by the end of 1989, the Black Coalition count, given reports we were getting from people in the community, their bodies were being dumped in schoolyards even, alleyways, etc. Our count was, Sonali, 90 women. Now, we're not detectives. We couldn't verify that. We just kept a count, or if there was a little slither in the Examiner, which I think is now defunct in Los Angeles, or in the LA Times, we would clip it, and we would really try to keep those counts. We would go out into the neighborhood, sometimes in the middle of the night, handing out, I think we've gave out during that period about 150,000 flyers that these murders were happening. So Lonnie Franklin right now, he's being charged, from what I understand, with 10 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, but they do have DNA evidence on him for at least another 10. But that's not the end of the story. If in fact he's innocent until proven guilty, if in fact he is guilty, we know that he had access to a dump site. He was employed in the sanitation department.
He was employed by the police department.
The police department, 77th Police Division.
Right.
And so, and meanwhile, the family members, and we can't forget the victims who've been so vilified in the press, called all kinds of names in the press.
And actually, I want to just mention for a second, the LAPD had this term, NHI, no human involved, and this was crimes involving drug addicts and sex workers, who literally were considered not human. What role did that play in them just ignoring this?
We think it's criminal negligence, frankly speaking, and we issued a press release recently calling it as such, because if you think about the fact that there was a 911 call where the body of Barbara Ware was found. Her mother, Diana Ware, is actually in the film. The mother was never notified, by the way, by LAPD that her child was a victim of the serial killer. LAPD held on to that 911 call for 22 years. Also, the bullet in Anitra, who was a survivor, that bullet was connected to other murders. They knew it was a serial killer. They held on to that for 22 years. That is criminal neglect, and we talk about the difference in culture. It really has to do with the culture within law enforcement that could come up with a term, no humans involved, and the devaluation of the lives of those women, but also the devaluation of those families, the lack of respect of even informing them in any decent way. Janissa, who's one of the victims, she has a son. He's now entering his teenage years. I mean, he has to deal with all of that. Laverne is trying to raise him with very, very little support. Right. So there are lots of, this is not over. There needs to be an investigation. As Nick mentioned, by the Department of Justice, we're hoping a congressional investigation, because there is something wrong that this went on for so long and nothing or very little was done about it.
Nick Broomfield, you delved deep into the community, and this is a story in your film told by members of the community. Tell us about Pam Brooks. She knew Lonnie Franklin. She plays a prominent role in your film. You joked that she was almost running your production at one point.
Yeah.
She's great.
I think that's kind of indicative, really, of what happens to, I mean, Pam, I think, is the most wonderful person. She's incredibly organized. She completely, she was 100% reliable. She was diligent. She followed through on everything.
To so many people.
Yeah, and so she was kind of a magnificent help to the production. I'm sure if Pam had been born in a different part of the city, she'd probably be running a corporation or some company by now. But, as it is, she has a problem making the rent at the end of every month. And so we just happened to meet Pam by chance on one of the first days of filming. She and my son, who actually shot the film, Barney, are really into playing backgammon. So it was a very natural kind of relationship. And then we would be going off filming, and Pam says, sort of, shall I come along? And then, of course, Pam knew so many of the women who were homeless on the street or still working on the street. She'd been on the street for like 30 years herself. She knew Lonnie Franklin. She'd been with him a couple of times, you know, and was able to tell us more about.
And in many ways felt that she avoided the fate that some of the
Well,
women.
yes, she avoided. She was lucky, you know, and at the same time knew a lot of the women and was able to. They trusted her, and you know, she treated obviously the other woman with a lot of compassion and respect, having been through it herself. So she was invaluable.
And you also spoke to friends of Lonnie Franklin. It was interesting to see their evolution through the film. These three friends of Lonnie Franklin who initially did not believe he was the murderer, couldn't believe. They stuck up for him. They admitted that he dealt in stolen cars, but nothing else. And everyone who knew him seemed to like him. But then they came back to you in the course of the film and then told you things that just were so obvious.
Well, you know,
I mean,
I think that, as you said, Lonnie was very popular in the neighborhood. He was sort of like the local fence. If you wanted a cheap washing machine or TV, he'd get it for you. He also had a lot of money. He could employ people, and in an area of incredibly high unemployment, it was hard to sort of turn your back on Lonnie. At the same time, I think the process of making a film makes people much more, it makes them focus on themselves because you're asking them questions about themselves. And I think a number of the friends kind of had a kind of, were worried about their relationship with him.
Well, they saw a lot of hints of very troubling things.
But I think they just sort of shunned them on. They just sort of got on with their lives and hadn't really taken it into account. And I think during the process of the film, they became quite introspective, and I think they became also quite remorseful, and their humanity came out, and I think they wanted to distance themselves from what had taken place.
Now, around the time that the murders started, Margaret, the crack cocaine explosion in LA took off, as we briefly mentioned, that we now know the CIA's role in that, well documented. Do you see these two things as connected, the murders in South LA and the drug epidemic?
Absolutely. They began around the same time, didn't they? And, you know, looking at Lonnie's friends and at the community, we see a community that's been devastated. We see very, very high unemployment rates. We see very little for young people to even to go outside and play, much less to be able to get some kind of income. We see the safety net shredded, where single mothers, you know, can no longer get any access to resources. And you know, I've had young people say to me, you know what, I'm going to go out in the street and do what I need to do to help to take care of my family and help take care of my mother.
And that enables somebody like Lonnie Franklin to prey on young people.
And also a lot of the things that might seem quite shocking to an audience in Santa Monica, honestly, because of the devastation, is quite normal. You know, somebody is dealing in stolen cars. Somebody could get your stuff, you know, and you don't ask any questions. I mean, when you have a community so devastated with so few resources and people who are considered like the bottom layer, kind of like a throwaway population, a population of people who've been criminalized, which I think we can't forget either, because a lot of serial murders start with sex workers because it is a vulnerable population who are criminalized. People know that. No humans involved. So Nick's film is very much part of a national context because it really shows a slice of a community that most people would like to forget about, even among the black middle class, that they really don't exist, but they do in South LA. They do in Ferguson. They do in Staten Island. They do in Bedford-Stuyvesant. This is a national story.
It's all the same
reflected.
thing.
A pocket of serial killers of black women in Cleveland, Ohio, the same place where Tamir Rice was shot.
Now, one of the people that you interviewed, Nick, is a friend of Lonnie Franklin's named Jerry, who admitted to you on camera that Lonnie Franklin would torture women in front of him. And at the time you filmed him, the police hadn't even interviewed him. This is a man, and Lonnie also admits that he had been convicted of prior crimes. His DNA should have been in the system. I know there was an issue around a proposition and people's privacy rights with DNA, Why did it take so long? Why were the police not interviewing the same people that you were interviewing? Maybe they have in the time since. Why was his DNA not in the system, and why did it take so long to even authorize looking for the DNA of one of his family members? Eventually it was his own son's
well,
DNA.
when actually there was a big screening of the film at the Egyptian a couple of weeks ago, and the whole kind of task force came along to see the film. And afterwards,
this is the police task force.
This is the police task force, yeah. And afterwards I said, you know, I can't believe that you haven't talked to Jerry. I mean, Jerry said he knew half of the 180 women that were found. You know, Lonnie Franklin took pictures of all the women that he was with. 180 of these pictures were found at Lonnie's house. Jerry said he knew half of those women because he went out with Lonnie every night picking up women. Yet the police still have not talked to him, and they still haven't talked to him. I mean, as of 2 weeks ago, the police had still not talked to Jerry. And I said, how is this possible? And very lamely, the main detective said, well, Jerry wouldn't talk to us. So kind of like, what's the point? I mean,
they couldn't subpoena him?
It is so lame and ridiculous. You just think, well, what do you have to do? It's so I think there is no pressure on them to get to the bottom of it. It's much more convenient to say, well, all the victims are probably in landfill somewhere. There doesn't seem, you know, if there seems to be no real need to get some kind of closure.
Yeah, and the pre-trial has been going on for the last four years right now. The family members are getting increasingly frustrated because there's now talk about maybe even continuing the pre-trial process for another year. Why is that?
The defense attorney, I understand, is stalling because he wants now to have all 900 pieces of evidence removed from Franklin's house to be photographed. So there's definitely stalling tactics. Now, how strong, Margaret, is the feeling in South LA of the LAPD having botched this investigation? And at the press conference when he was finally arrested, after he was arrested, it seemed as though the LAPD really tried to rewrite the history with then Mayor Villaraigosa. I'm paraphrasing, saying something like, this is 25 years of diligent and dedicated police work, which you then, I think, tried to correct the record, uninvited. But how deep is this feeling in South LA that we are a community that's been ignored? Because if this was white women in Westwood, it would have been a whole different story.
Everybody knows that. You just ask anybody and they will definitely tell you that. And with the press conference you referred to, I mean, it was really outrageous. And I don't think the police chief had anybody in public take the mic from him in that way. They were all, quite stunned. But people in the community were really glad that happened. Right. We're really glad that happened, because there has to be some kind of accountability. And Sonali, I can't tell you the trouble that we have had for decades now, getting people to pay some attention. I mean, even people who would. I also think there's some sexism involved in this, frankly, because I do think that if this was 20 or we suspect now as many as 200, a mini genocide, black men who were killed, the Reverend Al Sharpton, the civil rights leaders, they all would be down here. But actually, I had one of the leaders say to me, Margaret, there's a moral issue involved. And I said, yes, the moral issue is that women are being killed. He meant the moral issue was that this particular woman who was found down from his church was a sex worker.
So because they were sex workers, and not all of them, some were.
Yeah.
Or
crack.
Or
caught
addicted
up in the crack.
addicted to drugs. So
throwaway people.
Right, no humans involved. Finally, Nick Broomfield, what has the reaction to your film been so far? Congratulations on being shortlisted for Best Documentary at the Oscars. Where is it heading? I know people in Southern California, I mentioned, can catch it at the Lumley Playhouse this week through next Wednesday. What about people around the rest of the country?
Well, I think, we're talking about having a screening in Ferguson. It's going to be in New York later on this month. I'm getting it out there as much as I can. There are a number of local screenings around LA. I think we've got to get a dialogue going between the city council, who need to recognize that they have a real crisis on their hands here, with the rest of, with South Central. So I think those channels need to be opened up. And I think there needs to be a sort of, this needs to be part of the national debate. We need to get an internal inquiry going as to how this was possible.
And a memorial, a permanent memorial for the victims, which the Black Coalition is working on right now. And of course, it'll be at HBO.
Right.
HBO
So
It will be
will
going
be
out in HBO, I mean, I think quite soon, so that it's part of the national debate.
Again, the name of the film is Tales of the Grim Sleeper. It's director Nick Broomfield and one of the very prominent people featured in the film, a familiar voice to our KPFK listeners, Margaret Prescod. She is the founder of one of the main organizations fighting for justice, the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders. I want to thank the two of you very much for joining us, and best of luck to
Sonali.
you.
And you can watch Tales of the Grim Sleeper on HBO starting today. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. Kolhatkar. Workers in cities all over the nation are plagued by low wages and job insecurity, and they've been fighting back for higher wages and the right to a union. It should surprise us, however, that even in the nation's capital, and even among those workers who directly serve elected officials and policymakers, wages are so low that the spark of organizing has been lit. 600 workers employed by federal contractors who make and serve food for U.S. senators and do other jobs walked off their jobs last week. They were joined by more than 30 Senate employees, including members of the Senate Progressive Caucus. Private companies now dominate the service landscape in Washington, D.C. for government officials and aides. A cashier named Pamela told the Campaign for America's Future that she makes only $12 an hour and is not allowed to work full-time. More than 10 years ago, when she worked at the Senate, she made $48,000 a year. The shocking difference symbolizes the impact of privatization in D.C., which has strived to maximize profits at the expense of workers' lives. Joining me now is Paco Fabian. He's a spokesperson for Good Jobs Nation, a project of the Labor Federation Change to Win. Welcome to Uprising, Paco.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Now, who exactly walked out last week? Can you explain which workers participated, what industry they're in, who they serve, who they work for, etc.?
So the Good Jobs Nation campaign is a campaign of low-wage federal contract workers. These are workers who work in federal buildings all over the Washington, D.C. area. They work at places like Union Station, like the Ronald Reagan Federal Building, as well as some of the workers from the Capitol, and as you so mentioned, the workers from the U.S. Senate. So these are workers that are touched by the way the federal government does business in the private sector.
And last week's walkout, I understand, was not the first time that workers who are employed by federal contractors in D.C. Walked out. I understand it was the first time, I think, that food service workers and janitors joined in. Are these walkouts growing?
So this was the 12th strike that workers have been participating in, and it was the first time that we had Senate workers participate. These are workers that clean and serve food inside the Senate office buildings. Previously, we've had, like I mentioned, workers from the Capitol Visitor Center, which is the basement of the U.S. Capitol building, and workers in other federal buildings across Washington, D.C. go on strike. And it's really symbolic of the role that the federal government plays in the growing income inequality that we're seeing in our country.
So let's talk about why so many services for Congress and Capitol Hill have been privatized in the first place. I understand this goes back to a 2008 ruling or vote?
So the workers in the Senate in particular used to be federal employees. As you mentioned, Pamela used to have a pension. She used to earn a living wage. She was able to afford a house. But in 2008, those services were privatized, meaning the workers were moved off of the government roles, if you will, and a private company called Compass Group became the contractor for those jobs. They lost their pension, they lost their health benefits, and now they're earning anywhere between $11 and $13 an hour. They're not allowed to work full time. And you can imagine it's a much harder struggle for them than it was when they were actual government employees.
And this is so symbolic of the standard argument that business interests and those politicians that are influenced by corporate profits constantly trot out that if you privatize, things are more efficient. They might be more efficient in terms of generating profits, but the impact that they have on workers is pretty detrimental. Efficient, when it comes to workers' salary, simply means lower salaries and a much harder life for workers, right?
That's right. And look, across the country, we have around 2 million workers that are doing work under government contract. They work on direct government contracts, loans, leases, concessions, all this funded by taxpayer dollars. And about 70% of them rely on some sort of public assistance to make ends meet. 88% of them are people of color, 60% are women. So this is disproportionately affecting some of the most vulnerable communities in our country. And it's being paid for with taxpayer dollars. And taxpayers are actually paying twice for these contracts. They're paying once for the contract itself, and then a second time for all the public services that these workers have to rely on in order to make ends meet. So it's costing taxpayers twice. It's no longer more efficient to privatize. It's actually costing us more than it should.
And of course, money going into the pockets of corporate CEOs rather than taxpayers who are among those people who are working, who are employed by the government. So the CNN is reporting that late last Friday, the Senate Democrats saw a report that CNN did about a man named Charles Gladden who works at the Senate. He's so poor that he's homeless, even though he's actually earning money at the Senate. And the senators were so appalled that they promised that they are going to work towards getting a pay raise for Gladden and his fellow workers. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Is this a victory for Senate Democrats to respond to such news?
Well, look, it's very encouraging that Senate Democrats are responding to what's going on in their own buildings. But the truth is, workers are going on strike not just to increase their wages, but they also want the ability to form unions. They want to be able to sit down at the table with their employers and negotiate this on their own.
Right.
It would be great for them to be able to do that without having to have intervention from senators to make it happen. Again, it's very encouraging that senators are taking note of this. It's great that they're writing a letter to the architect of the Capitol trying to get raises for these workers, but it's more than just about raises. It's about the ability of workers to be able to empower themselves, have a say in their workplace, and be able to negotiate not only wages, but also benefits, time off, fair scheduling, and all the issues that are affecting low-wage workers across the country.
Paco, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, which is that, it's nice for workers to get some charity attention from the people that they serve. But in the end, it's better if they can use their own bargaining power to negotiate for themselves, to lobby for themselves. So how close, what is the prospect of these workers who, as you mentioned, now have had their 12th walkout? What's the likelihood that they could actually win a union?
Well, look,
or win the right to unionize.
Right, as you know, it's a very hard process. Yeah. The deck is certainly stacked against the workers when it comes to collective bargaining and having the ability to do so with their employers. But look, I think we're in a moment right now where, if you look at the way that the middle class was built in this country, it was built by workers having an ability to form unions and negotiate with their employers. That created the largest middle class that the world has ever seen. Over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen that middle class sort of start to crumble and disappear. And if we want to rebuild it, I think workers need to have the ability to form unions. And there's no better way to do that than to have politicians in this country lead by example, right? We have 6 or so candidates in the Senate that are trying to succeed President Obama at the White House. These are the same folks that are the workers that have gone on strike are serving these folks and cleaning up after these folks every day. So if they can't help the workers that they see every day, who are they going to be able to help?
Now, about a year and a half ago, Good Jobs Nation, your organization, won a victory for food service workers at 2 Smithsonian museums in Washington, D.C., and they won this after a series of strikes and one-day marches. What sort of victory did they win, and does this prove that organized action can have some effect?
Well, look, the workers in the Smithsonian museums, with the exception of the Air and Space Museum, are all now covered by a union contract, which is great. Now they have the ability to negotiate raises
And
benefits.
this happened from something that happened 2 years ago?
So what happened is the workers at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History and the newest Smithsonian Museum, which is the Museum of the American Indian, is what it's called, did not previously have union representation. After those workers went on strike a couple of times, their company made the right decision. They decided that it was much more in their interest to have their workers be productive and be happy, and the way that they thought this would work was for them to have a union. And so the only museum now on the National Mall that does not have union representation is the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum when it comes to food service. And the reason is that museum is serviced by McDonald's. So McDonald's is the only food outlet on the National Mall that does not allow their workers to unionize. But it happened because workers, raised their voices and went on strike and took risks, frankly, to make it happen. And so it's encouraging that this has happened. It's encouraging that, workers on the House side of the Capitol are unionized, but not on the Senate side. So the possibility is certainly there. And workers are hoping to be able to get there sooner rather than later.
And we know that workers who are unionized have higher wages. They have benefits because they're able to bargain for those, negotiate, and leverage their, their work and their effort and labor to get those, right? I mean, it's a pretty clear correlation, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think, if you look at hourly wages, a unionized worker tends to make, $2 or $3 more than a non-unionized worker does. There's certainly a benefit to workers. And look, there's plenty of companies that are also very profitable and allow their workers to form unions. You can look at examples like Costco and others. So ultimately, it's a choice, right? You either want to make a lot of money and disrespect your employees, or you can make a lot of money and make your employees happy, more productive, members and sharing in the profits that they're helping to create. So there's plenty of examples out there of good, profitable companies that have, unions, and it seems to be a harmonized relationship.
Now, Paco, let's talk about what President Obama has and hasn't done. The Progressive Caucus lobbied Obama with, of course, the agitation of workers to back them up to sign 2 executive orders to improve working conditions for federal contract workers. The Good Jobs Executive Order prevents employers who commit wage theft from receiving government contracts. And then a previous order signed by Obama raised the minimum wage to $10.10 for federal contract workers. And certainly the president seems responsive to contract workers, but could he do a lot better?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, 1010 is a good start, and preventing companies that engage in wage theft or other legal violations from receiving taxpayer dollars is also a good start. But workers need more than the minimum, right? Workers need the ability to form unions. What workers are asking for now is for the president to sign a model employer executive order where preference is giving the companies that pay at least $15 an hour and allow their workers to form unions, pay benefits, and et cetera. The president likes to talk about how the federal government is a model employer. Well, the federal government then should also do business with companies that are model employers, that treat their employees with respect, that allow them to bargain, that pay decent wages, provide benefits. And as we've mentioned before, these companies can also be very profitable.
And so you're saying that this is an executive order that the president could sign to pledge the government will do business with companies that pay their workers $15 an hour. This is something he could do with a stroke of a pen, does not even require congressional support?
That's right. I mean, just like his 1010 executive order did not require congressional support, and like the Fair and Safe Workplaces executive order did not require congressional approval, he could do an order that does this, that then brings close to 2 million workers closer to being able to live the lives that they want to live.
Paco Fabian, what is the link between this movement in the nation's capital and the broad national movement for better jobs, higher wages, and the right to a union? There is a huge movement now that has really sprung up just in the last few years, around the same time that the movement that you're working on is the Fight for 15 campaign of fast food workers and Walmart workers. Are these movements aligned? Are they working together?
Look, I think workers across all the industries you just mentioned, fast food, retail, and even federal contracting, are facing the same issues. And as a result, I think, they're all raising their voices and calling for similar solutions. So the truth is, as the economy has recovered in recent years, that recovery hasn't really been seen by workers, right? We lost a lot of decent middle wage jobs during the last recession. And those jobs have been replaced by low-wage service jobs, retail jobs, and federal contract jobs. And certainly, I think there's a link in that, workers are facing similar issues and asking for similar solutions.
So you're saying that there's no explicit coordination?
Well, look, I think, there's certainly coordination when it comes to asking for what the workers are asking for. But these are very separate campaigns with separate targets, right? Although you could argue that all these workers, like I mentioned, are facing the same sort of issues. So it almost seems like a natural fit that they would be asking for similar solutions. But look, there's a fast food campaign, there's a Walmart campaign, they're all separate campaigns, but certainly, again, the workers are facing similar issues and asking for similar solutions. So in that sense, I think, we have had, federal contract workers speak with some of the fast food workers, for example, retail workers that have spoken to fast food workers and others. There certainly is, I think, a level of solidarity between them.
Right.
And I think that has helped raise this issue across the country.
And of course, the difference is that federal contract workers are paid by federal tax dollars, and the other industries that many of these folks are fighting for higher wages in are private industries that don't necessarily have government contracts, although some might. So finally, Paco, where can our audience find out more information about the campaign that you're working on with federal workers? Is there a website and other ways to support it?
Absolutely. So you can go visit www.goodjobsnation.org, which is where you'll find sort of the most comprehensive information about the campaign, what the workers are asking for, and some of the issues that federal contract workers are facing. You can also follow Good Jobs Nation on Twitter and check out our Facebook page at Good Jobs Nation. You can find out information there about some of the latest stories that have come out regarding workers. You mentioned Charles Gladden and others. And hopefully there you can like our page, support what the workers are doing, and really take a look, if you're listening as a taxpayer, do you want your money to be used to keep workers in poverty, or would you rather it be used to create good jobs?
And that's goodjobsnation.org. If you missed it, we'll post it to our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today. Paco, thanks so much for joining us. Best of luck to you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
My guest, Paco Fabian, is a spokesperson for Good Jobs Nation. It's a project of the Labor Federation Change to Win. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Joseph Stone is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Your subscription sustains our TV production. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.